Colonel Potter, sir, my last wish is to be buried in my mother's wedding gown.
I've seen these Dodgers for 40 years, all the tricks. Dismissed!
There are television shows, and then there are television institutions. MASH was the latter. For 11 seasons, from 1972 to 1983, it planted itself at the center of American culture and refused to move. It made people laugh until they cried, and then it made them cry until they forgot they'd ever laughed at all. The series finale, Goodbye, Farewell and Amen, drew over 106 million viewers, a record that, to this day, no scripted television program has ever broken. But here's the thing about a show that runs for over a decade, it doesn't stay the same. People change. Priorities shift. Contracts expire. Creative visions collide. And sometimes, the people who helped build something extraordinary decide they need to walk away from it. MASH was no exception. Over its run, several of its most beloved cast members made the painful, complicated decision to leave. Some left chasing bigger dreams. Some left because the show had quietly outgrown the space it gave them. And others left because the emotional weight of the whole thing had simply become too much to carry. Each departure tells a different story, about ambition, about identity, about what it costs to give yourself completely to a role. So let's go through them, one by one, and look at what was really going on behind the cameras at the 4077th. To understand why McLean Stevenson left MASH, you have to understand what he thought he was signing up for. When the show premiered in the fall of 1972, it was conceived as an ensemble production, a revolving collection of characters bouncing off one another in the chaotic, absurd world of a mobile army surgical hospital. There was no single star, or at least, that was the idea. Stevenson played Lieutenant Colonel Henry Blake, the commanding officer of the 4077th. And he was very good at it. Henry Blake was bumbling and warm, a man who seemed perpetually surprised by his own authority. He wasn't a hero in the classical sense. He was a human being caught in an inhuman situation, doing his awkward best. Audiences responded to that immediately. Stevenson won a Golden Globe for the role. He was charming, funny, and impossible to dislike. The problem, from Stevenson's perspective, was that the show began to evolve in a direction that didn't include him at its center. Alda, who played the sharp-tongued and deeply moral Hawkeye Pierce, had both the talent and the ambition to shape the series from within. He became a writer and director in addition to lead actor, and as his creative fingerprint spread across the show, so did Hawkeye's dominance of the narrative. This wasn't malicious, it was organic. But it left Stevenson feeling increasingly marginal that he wanted to carry a show. He wanted to be, in his own words, the guy. He genuinely believed he had the charisma to anchor something of his own, and from a purely objective standpoint, it wasn't an unreasonable belief. He had presence, he had warmth, and he had years of experience. What he perhaps didn't fully appreciate was how rare the specific alchemy of MASH truly was, how the writing, the cast chemistry, and the historical moment all combined to make something that couldn't simply be reconstructed elsewhere. When Stevenson decided not to return for season 4, the writers made the historic choice not to give Henry Blake a comfortable exit. There would be no reassignment, no farewell tour of duty. Instead, Radar walked into the operating room and delivered the news in a single sentence. Henry's plane had been shot down over the Sea of Japan. No survivors. The camera held on the stunned faces of the cast, most of whom learned the ending only when they read the scene. The silence that followed was not performed. It was real. The fallout for Stevenson himself was genuinely sad. His NBC sitcom was cancelled quickly. A follow-up project fared worse. He spent the rest of his career working steadily but never recapturing the cultural footprint he'd had at the 4077th. By the early 1980s, he was openly reflecting on the decision with regret. He described MASH as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, one he had, in his own estimation, thrown away in pursuit of something that turned out not to exist. He passed away in 1996. His colleagues remembered him with genuine affection, and the character he left behind remains one of the most memorable in television history. The role that wasn't enough for him ended up being the most enduring thing he ever did. If McLean Stevenson's departure was dramatic, a public exit, a shocking on-screen death, a moment etched into pop culture memory, then Wayne Rogers' exit was almost the opposite. It was quiet, legally murky, and over before most people realized it had happened. Rogers played Trapper John McIntyre, Hawkeye's closest friend and partner in chaos during the show's first 3 seasons. The two characters were a unit, defined by their banter, their shared contempt for authority, and the deep, unspoken bond that tends to form between people surviving something terrible together. Wayne Rogers brought a loose, natural magnetism to the role. He wasn't acting so much as inhabiting. But Rogers had signed on with the understanding, or at least the belief, that MASH would be a genuine ensemble. As the show developed and Hawkeye's role expanded, Trapper began to feel like a supporting character in his own storyline. Rogers watched his scenes narrow, his dialogue thin, his function in episodes reduced to reacting rather than initiating. He later described Trapper as having become a character who mostly just agreed with whatever Hawkeye said. That wasn't why he'd signed up. What made his situation legally unusual was that he had never actually signed a formal contract with the production. His agreement was, effectively, a handshake deal. When the producers discovered he wasn't returning and threatened legal action, their attorneys determined there was nothing to enforce. Rogers had not broken a contract. He had simply chosen not to continue with an informal arrangement that no longer served him. His absence created a logistical headache for the writers. Season 4 opened with Hawkeye returning from leave to discover that Trapper had already been discharged, gone home without a goodbye. The abruptness of it was jarring for audiences who had spent 3 years watching these two men as inseparable. There was no farewell party, no last joke between friends, no final scene. One episode he was there, the next, he wasn't. In his place came B.J. Honeycutt, played by Mike Farrell, a character with a different energy entirely. Where Trapper was wild and impulsive, B.J. was steadier, more emotionally available, more prone to introspection. The dynamic between him and Hawkeye was less combustible and more genuinely tender. Many viewers at the time resented the change. Looking back, it's harder to argue that MASH didn't benefit from it. Rogers himself moved through a handful of acting roles after MASH before eventually redirecting his energy into finance and investment. He became a successful commentator on economic affairs and built significant wealth through Wall Street ventures. By most measures, his post-MASH life was a success story, just not the kind Hollywood tends to tell. He never seemed to carry bitterness about his departure. Alan Alda, reflecting on Rogers' death in 2015, described him as one of the smartest and most genuinely curious people he had ever worked with. The friendship, whatever the circumstances of the exit, survived intact. There's a particular cruelty in being the person whose job it is to remain innocent. Gary Berghoff played Corporal Walter Radar O'Reilly, wide-eyed, soft-spoken, a boy man who seemed to absorb the grief of the war through his oversized ears while everyone else processed it through sarcasm or surgery. Radar was the emotional center of the 4077th in a way that was easy to take for granted, because that's exactly what genuine warmth tends to make you do. Berghoff was also the only member of the television cast to have appeared in Robert Altman's 1970 film version of MASH. He brought a continuity to the show that was unique and irreplaceable. But he also brought something else, a deep personal sensitivity that, over the course of 7 seasons, began to fracture under the pressure of production. The schedule was relentless. Television in that era was not what it is now, with limited seasons and generous breaks. MASH produced episode after episode across long production cycles, and Berghoff was a perfectionist in a role that demanded emotional availability in every scene. He struggled with anxiety. He struggled with depression. He struggled with the particular loneliness of being on set when you feel like your mind is somewhere else entirely. More than the professional strain, though, was the personal cost. Berghoff was a father, and the long hours on set meant watching his daughter grow up in glimpses rather than continuously. He later spoke about missing her early years as a wound that never fully healed, a mistake, as he put it, that he never stopped regretting. At some point, the math became undeniable. He was giving everything to the show and not enough to the life he actually wanted to be living. There were also professional frustrations. He felt underappreciated by the production, not in a grandiose, star ego way, but in the quieter sense of an actor who suspected he was being taken for granted precisely because his character's emotional reliability made him seem effortless. His co-star Mike Farrell later reflected that Gary underestimated how much the cast and crew respected him, which suggests a disconnect between how Berghoff felt and how he was actually perceived. When he left in Season 8, the show gave him one of its most carefully crafted send-offs. The 2-part episode Goodbye, Radar followed the character through a farewell that felt completely earned. He'd received news from home, his uncle had died, his family's farm was struggling, his mother needed him. And so Radar O'Reilly, the boy who had arrived at the 4077th clutching a stuffed animal, finally decided to go home. The final image, Radar walking away into the Korean landscape, his teddy bear left behind on Hawkeye's bunk, hit audiences with a sorrow that was entirely disproportionate to the fact that they were watching a fictional character leave a fictional army camp, which tells you everything about how real Berghoff had made him. After MASH, he stepped back from Hollywood substantially. He tried a few projects, including a short-lived spin-off, but nothing caught. Gradually, he turned his attention to painting, to wildlife conservation, and, in one of those genuinely surprising postscripts, to inventing. He holds several patents. He built a quieter life, closer to home, closer to the natural world. In his own words, he left to pick up the pieces of his life. Nobody who had watched what the show cost him could really argue with that. There is something almost noble about Larry Linville's exit from MASH, because it came not from conflict or frustration but from a clear-eyed recognition of a creative limit. He played Major Frank Burns for 5 seasons, the petty, self-righteous, bureaucratic antagonist who gave Hawkeye and Trapper someone to torment. Frank Burns was pompous, cowardly, and small in ways that felt specifically designed to irritate. Audiences loathed him enthusiastically, which meant Linville was doing exactly what the role required. The problem was that the role never expanded beyond that requirement. Frank Burns at the end of Season 5 was essentially the same Frank Burns who had appeared at the beginning of Season 1. His insecurities hadn't deepened. His prejudices hadn't been challenged. His relationship with Margaret Houlihan had cycled through the same beats without arriving anywhere new. While every other character on MASH was growing, learning, suffering, changing, Frank was static. A cartoon villain in a show that was increasingly refusing to be cartoonish. Linville, as an actor, had range that the character simply didn't call upon. He recognized this. And crucially, he also recognized that staying would not change it. The writers had pushed Frank Burns about as far as the character's internal architecture allowed. To genuinely evolve him would have required dismantling what made him functional as a foil, and the show wasn't prepared to do that when his replacement hadn't yet been found. So Linville made the decision himself, without being asked. He declined to renew his contract at the end of Season 5, explaining simply that he had taken the character as far as he could go. It was one of the more mature professional decisions in the show's history, even if it wasn't widely recognized as such at the time. His departure opened space that the writers filled brilliantly. Charles Emerson Winchester III, introduced in Season 6 and played by David Ogden Stiers, was everything Frank was not: educated, genuinely skilled, complex in his arrogance. Where Frank's snobbery was hollow, Winchester's was rooted in actual ability. Where Frank's cruelty came from weakness, Winchester's came from a kind of armored pride that slowly revealed something more vulnerable underneath. The show didn't just replace a villain, it promoted itself to a different kind of storytelling entirely. Linville continued to work in television after MASH but never found another role with the same cultural visibility. It is one of the quiet ironies of the show's history that the character who was most universally disliked in the narrative is remembered with genuine warmth by the people who made it, and with a kind of rueful affection by the fans who loved to hate him.